Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Well, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by the wonderful people at ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA works very hard to support animal studies scholars. They bring us together, they keep us informed, they make us feel as though we're part of a community, and they do it all with volunteer workers. So I would really encourage you to have a think about becoming a member of ASA. Membership is $50 Australian for the waged and only $25 for those people who are either unwaged or are in a financially difficult situation. So please think about joining ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Okay, let's get down to business. This is a really special episode for me of Knowing Animals. I have a return guest. This person was on the show before, but it was before we got our fancy new equipment. So for many people, this will be the first chance to hear one of the superstars of animal studies in all her glory. This week, I'm joined by Professor Lori Gruen. Lori is William Griffin Professor of Philosophy at Wesleyan in the USA, and we're going to discuss her brand new book, Critical Terms for Animal Studies, which was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2018. Welcome, Lori.
Oh, it's so great to be back, Siobhan.
So, Lori, why this book? What inspired you to put this book together?
Well, one of the things that I think is very exciting at the moment is that animal studies has really sort of found its own footing in a way, and I wanted to create a volume that could be a touchstone textbook that people can turn to for students who might not have support in their universities or their classes, that they can figure out what the leading thinkers in animal studies are thinking about, what the key concepts in animal studies might be. It's meant to be really a grounding text to help all of us, including those of us who are more senior scholars, to sort of dig into some of these concepts that those of us who have been working in the field have been developing over the last several decades now. So it's really meant to sort of say, here we are, this is what we're doing. And importantly, I think that the time where people were saying things like, oh, it's a developing field, or it might be starting out. We're past that now. We really are at a space where we have so many students and so many scholars and so many activists who are actually talking about animal studies. So this collection is meant to be sort of a way of further solidifying the kind of work that's being done.
How wonderful. So, Lori, you write the introduction. You also have a chapter in the book. So just thinking about some of the observations you make in the introduction, one of the things you discuss is the range of different terms that are used to describe the field. Can you tell us what some of them are and what they mean to you and why you think perhaps some terms are more suitable than others?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I really wanted to do was to call this volume Critical Terms for Animal Studies. I think of animal studies as a centrally important way of thinking about what it is that we're doing when we're exploring, both in our activist work and our scholarly work, our relationships with other animals. So animal studies, I think, is important. Now, early days of animal studies, there was some confusion because people thought, oh, animal studies, that means you're studying animal bodies. So there were a group of people who were involved in what I call animal studies now, who decided to call it human animal studies. And then there was some pushback against that human animal studies, thinking, why is the human separate from the animal? And I'm sympathetic to that way of thinking. There's also a critical animal studies. And I think that critical animal studies, at least the early days of critical animal studies, was more thinking, for example, about sort of critical race studies. So putting animal studies and critical race studies in the same sort of genre. I think animal studies is that. It is an interdisciplinary kind of scholarly project that is accountable to a movement, the animal movement, the animal protection movement. So the critical is sort of superfluous in a way, although I'm happy that the book is called Critical Terms for Animal Studies. So the critical part is still there. There's also another area called anthrozoology, which I think is a little more science-oriented and much less activist-oriented. So animal studies, I think, is a nice way of describing what we do in the ways that we think of, like, for example, gender studies or indigenous studies or Black studies, or environmental studies, queer studies. So this is, I think, it puts us into that sort of framework where we're doing this interdisciplinary work that's accountable to activist work. And there's a lot of variety, but I think that still captures that.
Wonderful. And Lori, in the introduction, you draw parallels with these other fields of study that are heavily linked or responding to pressing social demands such as women's studies and environmental studies, etc. But you also point out that there's perhaps something particular about animal studies and the kind of approach we're taking. Can you say something about how you see us as animal studies scholars relating to these other traditions, women's studies, environmental studies, etc.?
Yes, so I think that importantly, in the case of, I'm going to use women's studies and what now gets called gender studies or women, gender and sexuality studies or feminist gender and sexuality studies, however that gets called. Importantly, the activists who wanted to start women's studies, which is really an important moment in the history of the academy where academic work was not detached from the lives and experiences of people who worked in the academy. Women's studies was always a political sort of intervention in what we could call men's studies, everything else, right? And what's great about women's studies now is it's you get PhDs in women's studies if you so desire. People get hired in women's studies, and people are very much in part of a larger social and political conversation around the lives and well-being of women, and also women, men and non-binary people. And so it's really a very important, really social justice issue. Animal studies is similar in that we have a situation where we have billions of animals who are suffering from human practices. Animal studies is involved in trying to think through various ways in which animals are represented and how they're treated and what our ethical relationships with them might be. But animals aren't in our classrooms. Animals aren't in the academy. And so while I think there's important similarities between the study of, let's say, gender or the study of race and an accountability to those people who maybe aren't in the academy but are working for gender or racial justice, similarly, we need to be accountable to justice for animals, but the animals aren't actually in our classrooms. And so there's always going to be an element of representation and distance that we need to both theorize, but I hope, and I think is part of the work that I do in general, we're trying in an important way to be sensitive to their interests and needs and vulnerabilities and concerns, which vary. You can't really talk about animals as a category. You can't really talk about women as a category. We know that from gender studies as well. So that's part of what I think is both the similarity and dissimilarity of animal studies and other areas of interdisciplinary concern.
So the book features an absolutely stellar lineup of scholars. Can you tell us a little bit about how you made decisions about what terms to include and who to invite in that kind of process?
So this book, Critical Terms for Animal Studies, is part of a series at the University of Chicago. Critical Terms for Literary Studies was the very first volume. Critical Terms for Religious Studies is another volume. It's very exciting that Critical Terms for Animal Studies is part of this prestigious series at the University of Chicago. One of the things that they're most well known for is making sure that, because it's meant to be in some way a book that represents the field, that there are recognizable senior scholars who are represented in the volume. This is one of the this is the most peer-reviewed books that I've done. There were 8 peer reviewers at the level of the prospectus, and then 10 reviewers of the manuscript. I've never, ever heard of such a thing. And the exciting thing, and I was also worried, I'm like, but there's only about 4 people who said no. Right? So how are you going to find all these people? But the good news is that it was part of a sort of generative process to help me come up with the terms. And what I was really hoping to do is to have people who have a very specific voice about their terms. And I'm proud to say that many of the people who I asked accepted, and that there are more women than men in the volume, and that every piece is just really informative and exciting, and really very proud of this book.
Wonderful. Now, in addition to being the editor and writing the introduction, you also have a chapter, and your chapter's on empathy. Can you tell listeners a little bit about why empathy matters to you from a animal studies perspective?
Empathy is I've been thinking about empathy for many years now. I have another book that we've talked about in the program before, Entangled Empathy. And empathy is, for me, a really important tool and process for thinking about our relationships with other animals and making those relationships better. Much of the work in animal ethics, and I'm an animal ethicist, I'm a philosopher, much of the work is usually about either promoting their interests or promoting their rights. And I think that focusing on empathy and the relationships that we're in with other animals is a really important alternative way of thinking about our ethical responsibilities towards other animals. And so when I wrote Entangled Empathy, I was interested in trying to bring a care perspective to bear on discussions in animal ethics. And in the chapter in Critical Terms for Animal Studies on Empathy, I take it a little bit further and try to incorporate some of the criticisms that I've gotten over the last few years to try to respond to those criticisms. And I think that ultimately the notion of empathy has really gotten a lot of uptake. And so there's more discussion of empathy. And I think also it's really important from a perspective of thinking about this in terms of feminist animal studies and thinking about the ethics of care as an important way of thinking about animal ethics alongside these other traditions, utilitarianism and rights-based theories. So empathy is sort of a third tradition, as it were. And so that's part of why I'm really interested in it. I don't want to ever really say, I think that being concerned about animals' interests is obviously centrally important. So it's not to say that we're not concerned about their interests. But what an ethics of care does, and what empathy allows, is for us to think about ourselves in these relations with particular others, to attend to the sameness and the difference that we have with other animals. And that, I think, will ultimately help us to navigate these really vexed relationships in ways that matter. One other thing I wanted to say about this is that too often we think of other animals in these traditional ways of sort of adjudicating ethical concerns as like chimpanzees. They're as smart as 3-year-old children. And I think to myself, well, which 3-year-old children and which chimpanzees? Chimpanzees are really distinct. I have a friend, Sarah chimpanzee, who's older than I am, in her 50s. There's a chimpanzee that I know who's a teenager. There's chimpanzees that are infants. You just can't talk about chimpanzees as being equivalent to 3-year-old children. So part of what I think empathy allows us to do is really pay attention to the particularity, the personalities, the differences, and all sorts of other kinds of interests that animals might have.
Wonderful. Well, Lori, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer quick questions. You're a return guest, so you've got 4 quick questions. Are you ready for your 4 quick questions?
Sure.
So what's been the most satisfying or rewarding aspect of being an animal studies scholar or working in the field of animal studies?
Well, that's a hard question, but I think the most rewarding part is getting to spend time both with a bunch of different animals, including human animals who do great work like you, Siobhan, but also to spend time with the chimpanzee friends of mine that I know, and dogs and cows, and just now a goanna. This is one of the things that I think is so rewarding.
Wonderful. So what's been the most challenging or disheartening aspect of working in the field?
I think there's, it's always difficult when you're in a new field, being accepted within the academy, being taken seriously. I think we're now hopefully turning a corner, and that's very exciting. But it has been a challenge. I think it would be a mistake to think of it as easy. And I know these are quick questions, but one quick way of saying this is that, the world still doesn't really care about animals. And so we're still up against, even if we're accepted in the academy and the movement is making progress, the world still has a long way to go.
Indeed. Well, Lori, this is your chance to give a shout out to an animal studies scholar who is perhaps either emerging or someone who you think hasn't received the attention they deserve. Perhaps they're working in a language other than English or working in the global south, etc., etc. Is there anyone you'd like to name?
Well, I actually have to name my co-editor and the organizer of Animalities too, one of the organizers, Fiona Probyn-Rapsey, who has just been unbelievably generative and generous in her work on behalf of both animal studies scholars and me. So I just have to give a shout out to Fiona.
Wonderful. Yes, and I can second that shout out for Fiona. So, Lori, are you optimistic about the future of human, non-human animal relations?
It's a bad time to ask me that question, Siobhan. I'm actually pretty hopeless. I think part of it has to do with the recent report on the climate issues, and it really does put a different sense on what it is that we're doing. However, hope itself, I think, is something that is always oriented towards the future. And if there really isn't going to be a future that we can imagine, that doesn't mean we should just kind of wallow where we are. So one of the exciting new ways I'm thinking is to just do things now that matter and are meaningful to help other human animals and help other animals now, and maybe not orient ourselves so much towards the future, given that we may not have one.
So well, that's very very wise and something we need to hear. That aside, Lori, what are you working on next? Where's the future for you?
Well, one of the things that I've been really excited to be thinking about is, as you know, captivity is another area that I'm really interested in. And I've been teaching philosophy in prisons for a number of years. And so, and happily, the incarcerated people that I work with actually know that I'm also interested in animal issues. So I'm thinking a lot more about how to reframe our understandings of and relationships to those who are captive, to try to give voice to those who are captive, whether they are humans or other animals.
Wonderful. So where can people go to find out more about your work?
I have a website. It's www.lorigruen.com. And, of course, I'm at Wesleyan, so you could find me there. There is the Critical Terms for Animal Studies volume and the new volume that Fiona Probyn-Rapsey and I co-edited called Animalities.
Lovely. And for listeners, for some of you, it may be, for all of us, probably it's expensive to buy these books, but please have a think about ordering it for your institution. Some institutions you can just jump on the library website and suggest it. In other institutions, you perhaps need to find a friendly or sympathetic scholar who will make that order. But if we can get these books in libraries, that means more people can read and learn about animal studies.
It's a great idea.
Yeah. Well, Lori, thank you so much for joining us for Knowing Animals.
Well, thank you so much, Siobhan.
And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, you can follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals. You can also follow us on Facebook at Knowing Animals. And most importantly, don't forget to leave a review at iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us and therefore to learn about animals and animal studies. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.